In general, trust in journalism is at a historic low, right? There's this huge perception of media bias, and it seems to be increasing. In reality, to your point, is there actually more bias in journalism today than there used to be in the past?
Nobody gets to decide who can call themselves a journalist. And increasingly, those lines between news and commentary and entertainment and what's agenda-driven content and what's a pink slime site and what is a disinformation project that's in hiding or a conspiracy theory website, those lines have all been blurred. And people say that they get their news, especially young people will say in focus groups that I watch or in surveys, that they respond to, that what are your sources for news? Well, I get a lot of my news from Google or Facebook. Well, those aren't news sources, those are platforms. So the reality is it's very confusing for many consumers of news or many consumers of media to understand what they're getting. And a lot of what they're getting is biased. It's deliberately biased. There's a lot of chum in the water. And there's also been an effort by some political candidates or parties over time to weaponize the notion that every news source is biased and you can't believe or trust anything. So I do think there is more bias in media today, and it's easy to confuse that with bias in news. The key, if you are a reader or a viewer or a consumer of media, is to try to understand what is the product that you're consuming and what is that reporter or that commentator or that news organization's mission.
You would say that there still is a thing as unbiased news sources, correct? Or is there not? It's more that there are more sources that purport to be news that aren't?
So I really think media literacy is key here. It's important to understand the difference in the missions of organizations. Just because something calls itself news doesn't mean that its mission is to deliver unbiased, nonpartisan facts. There are organizations that can call themselves news whose mission is to deliver either partisan facts to a partisan audience or to drive an outcome or just to build audience or in some cases to mislead people. So you can't just look at one organization that makes you uncomfortable and say you can't trust anyone. It is, I'm sorry to put the burden of this on news consumers, but it's really on each of us to try to do our homework. And it's also, by the way, completely fine to consume news product or news and entertainment product that you find entertaining or that makes you happy or that makes you angry or that makes you curious. That's completely fine. But it doesn't mean that it is fact-based, unbiased news or aiming to be those things. So like understanding the purpose and the mission statement of the product that you're consuming will really help you to be able to differentiate between what is something that you can read or watch or listen to get the facts and whether you like them or not, and what is something that you can consume because it feels comfortable to you or because it really engages you. It can be fine to stoke or shape your opinion or your thoughts or just get you engaged. But there are places where you can go. And I'm talking about mainstream news organizations, the Associated Press, major television networks, major digital news organizations that used to be known as newspapers, news companies like Axios, for whom I have reported and advised, whose mission is to give you facts so that you can make your own opinion.
So let's talk a little bit about polls. A recent poll found that 53% of Americans are extremely or very concerned that news organizations report inaccuracies or misinformation during the election. And from that same poll, 44% worry that the accurate information will be presented in a biased way that favors one side. So how can people evaluate the credibility of their media sources?
There are a number of sources, of media sources, that people can access to try to assess the credibility of the media source that they're looking at. There are some basic tips that people can try to employ themselves. If you read something from a news organization or an organization that you think is news, go online and look up a few facts. Who owns them? Who is their editorial leadership? What's their mission statement? How do they say that they handle editorial standards? And how do they say that they handle corrections and errors? If you can't find this very basic information, or if you find it, but it's sort of nonsensical or goes in a loop, that's a really good red flag. A number of sources that help people to try to evaluate the credibility of news organizations. I'm thinking about the News Literacy Project, which has a number of tips for how you can sort of self-direct on this front. I'm talking about an organization called NewsGuard, which has established news reliability ratings. And I'm talking about an organization called Ad Fontes that has a media bias chart that you can access online. There are other sources as well, but just the three I mentioned are places that you can go to search out the name of a source where you're getting your news and try to understand how others have assessed its reliability.
Thank you for that. So speaking of mechanisms, fact checking. In 2008, there were 11 fact checking websites, which climbed to 424 by 2023. So
I didn't know that. That's an incredible stat.
So is fact checking even an effective way to counter misinformation at this point?
The reality is that there is a misinformation fire hose right now, and some of that misinformation just means it's inaccurate information. The most troubling kind of misinformation is disinformation. That's where the people who are spreading it are knowingly creating and spreading bad information to confuse people. There's way too much misinformation and disinformation for even 400 and whatever fact-checking outfits to grab everything. It is like trying to fight a fire with like a teaspoon and a glass of water. These large news organizations and fact-check resources, some tied to universities, some tied to newsrooms, their mission is also to do the nuanced stuff, to help you understand when something's like, it's kind of true, but it's maybe taken out of context. And that can be really helpful as well. The sad reality is most Americans don't read most fact checks, but if you are, all you can do is take care of your own media ecosystem if you want to know whether something is true or not. And it is out there. It may already be addressed on one of these major fact check sites, or you can contact them and ask them to help you find out.